Well, thank you about that, Chuck, because seriously, these concepts pull on each other. And I think you've outlined that well. There's a tension. I loved your describing the landscape as trying to understand how to fence off areas of reality. So we all agree that humans have a capacity to do many things. However, that doesn't mean that just because we have that capacity, we therefore have the moral imperative to express ourselves in that full capacity. The professor makes a point that the medievals struggled with the ideas that came out of antiquity, in particular, the priority or the primacy of what we are.
This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Miko Ear John Surrey's Chapter 34, Identity and Moral Agency, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
So the first question was, what are we? And looking outside of the informed Christian position, we see that in this classically theistic idea, in this classical idea, there's a really beautiful sentence in there. The professor says the opposition between Plato and Aristotle concerning whether we are souls or bodies was never really resolved. However, in modern conceptions of personal identity, we still carry both the intuition that we are psychological selves and the intuition that we are bodily beings. I think it's beautiful to note that the medieval thinkers really wrestled with this quite nicely. The professor talks about references, discussions from Augustine, even going back to Origen, as well as from outside of Christianity. There was work from Averroes and from the Islamic traditions in trying to address what we are. And it seems to be a reasonable conclusion from this period that we are a syncretism, we are a unity of psychological beings and bodily beings. And as difficult as all the schools of thought have been, it seems that it's very difficult for any school of philosophy or theology, for that matter, to ignore one or the other. So, in other words, if somebody says we're nothing more than our bodies and there is no such thing as the soul, well, very quickly we run into some real serious objections. There are just so many fundamental issues that such a thesis doesn't seem to harmonize with. And it's the same thing with the exact opposite. We're simply non-corporeal souls, and we're not even bodily beings. And lest you think that there is no one who thinks this, may I remind you, Chuck, of our good friend, the man who rows his boat, who holds to this philosophy. You remember our childhood saying, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, merrily, life is but a dream. That's the other extreme there. And who's gone past that? Who's made anything productive past that? Not simply within Christian circles or classical circles, but even in modernistic discussions. Who speaks and doesn't acknowledge this tension with any integrity? Now, there's a lot more here, and I was hoping to get further with that, but we really did go down some interesting rabbit trails. So I want to thank you for that, Chuck. How would you want to wrap up these sections that we talked about here? And what do you think about the tension between the psychological identity, the non-corporeal self, and the corporeal self, and how we have to live in a world that doesn't just recognize one or the other over the other? But how do we move forward with that?
No, I think that's a great question, and there's so much there. Even just thinking about issues of identity today, whether it's things like gender versus sexual identity, whether it's about racial identity, those kinds of questions are really caught up in where do we fall on the primacy of body or soul or the balance of that. And I do think that there is some arguments on these issues. The primacy of the soul or the psychological self has really taken hold, and the body is just unimportant to the whole thing. It's just an appendage. But what's really important is how one psychologically feels, the experience that they have psychologically of themselves. And when we get entirely platonic, perhaps shall we say, in that regard, it can lead to some sort of unusual results. On the other hand, we can go so far the other way and fail to acknowledge that there is a soul, a psychological self, something that is incorporeal, something that is not necessarily able to be observed in very clear scientific ways. And if we ignore that and only think about just what we see as far as the body, we are in some peril there as well. And we deal with that. Now, perhaps have we started going more to one direction than the other? I think those are some good discussions that we could have. But it is really quite amazing how much. And by the way, I appreciated how you used that terminology, because I think moderns don't often talk about body and soul, but yet they do. They just use different terms. They talk about biology versus psychology or things like that. But it is really interesting how so much of what we're talking about today, as far as identity, is wrapped up in these very same things that people going back to Plato and Aristotle and going back to Avicenna and Averroes were talking about. And I agree with your analysis that really this is one of those areas where balance is what's needed. We don't always, not in every circumstance, are we willing to sort of go halfway and have a syncretism with other beliefs. But this is one area where I think even that idea of body and soul, and of humans being both, is something that we see a balance on even in scripture. And so I appreciate how you frame that, because I think that ought to frame how we think about who we are and what is our identity. And even in these very 21st century sort of discussions that we have about these things, it's really helpful to think about them that way. So yeah, we didn't get deeply into that 21st century argument, but so much of what we talked about here today has an impact.
Thank you for that, my friend. We find that issues of identity are so contemporary for us. What is so much of the trend in the culture in recent years? Maybe let's say the last 20 years. We've seen the rise of this self-identification movement. And in some sense, this movement wishes to acknowledge the primacy of a non-materialistic part of us, like you said, the psychological state, to use a more modern term, deciding or choosing to be or defining one's own identity in terms of that, sometimes to the ignoring of things, physical factors like the body, like issues of biology. The medievals really worked with this. And even though they didn't go into all of the back alleys that, let's say, contemporary thought has branched out in recently, I think we can see a very reputable treatment in this chapter. And ideas that overemphasize one over the other are not going to last. They're not going to work. They're also going to fail to be adequate to represent the things that people believe to be true about the world that we live in. In other words, these are ideas that, if you take them to their consequences, leads us to these absurd existentialistic situations. And thank you, my friend, for this. What a beautiful chapter, clear and excellent. I don't feel like I did it justice in terms of going through what the professor had to say in as good a detail as we might like, but these other issues were so important that I felt we had to bring them up anyway. And for folks here who are intrigued by this discussion, let me just recommend this chapter, the professor's material. Read it for yourself. There's so much good in here. And I think we'll try to move forward with things for a future session. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for just delicious discussions, excellent bringing up of describing the situation and all of the factors involved. And I think I'd love to have more discussions about this with other folks, with other thinkers. I think the medievals have just whetted our appetite. Let me throw it over to you for any final thoughts for today.
Yeah, I agree. I like the way you put that. The medievals have whetted our appetite, and beyond that, the medievals have things that add to the discussion that we can have today. And so, while they maybe did not deal with some of the same specific issues that we talk about in 2022, there is much to the way they've thought about things that can apply to those things. So it is profitable to be thinking about what people have said about these issues of identity and body and soul and self-interest even today. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to go back and to look at those things and to review them from the perspective of the professor who wrote this chapter and others as well. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. It really was a good one today.